The world did not welcome her. It rejected her before she could even understand what existence meant. The night she was born, the sky above the small village was unusually still. No wind moved through the fields. No animals made a sound. Even the distant mountains seemed to hold their breath, as if something unseen was watching the moment unfold. Inside a dim wooden house, a woman cried out in pain as life entered the world. But the moment the child was born, everything changed. Silence fell. Not peaceful silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. The midwife froze before she even touched the child. The father, standing near the doorway, felt his body go cold without knowing why. Because the child they saw was not what they expected. Pale skin like untouched snow. Hair so light it almost disappeared in the dim candlelight. Eyes reflecting something unnatural, something unfamiliar, something the human mind struggled to accept. For a long moment, no one spoke. Not because they did not have words, but because they were afraid of what speaking might bring. Then, slowly, fear entered the room. Not from the child, but from the meaning they gave her. A whisper broke the silence. Cursed. That single word spread like poison. The mother, exhausted and trembling, turned her head slightly as if trying to see her child properly for the first time. But instead of love, her expression twisted into confusion. And then fear. Not hatred. Fear. Because in their world, fear was older than love. And fear always won. They did not give her a name that night. Names were meant for things that would survive. And survival was no longer guaranteed for her. Outside the small house, villagers gathered without being called. News traveled fast in places where superstition was law. A white-haired child had been born. An albino. A deviation from nature. To them, it was not biology. It was meaning. And meaning was dangerous. The elders arrived before sunrise. Their walking sticks tapped against the ground like final judgments being delivered slowly. One of them spoke without entering the house. Such children do not belong here. No debate. No discussion. Only conclusion. Inside, the father clenched his fists. Not in defiance, but in helplessness. Because he knew what those words meant. If the village discovered her fully, his entire family would be destroyed with her. Not physically at first. Socially. Emotionally. Completely erased. And in that world, erasure was worse than death. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into years. And the child grew. But not like other children. She learned silence before she learned words. She learned distance before she learned touch. Her world was not a cradle of warmth. It was a cage of avoidance. Her mother fed her without looking into her eyes. Her father spoke to her only when necessary, and even then, his voice carried something fragile, like he was afraid the walls might hear him. Other children were told not to approach their house. Not because she was dangerous, but because association was dangerous. And so she grew up learning a truth she never questioned. She was something people endured, not something they embraced. Sometimes she would stand near the window and watch other children play in the distance. Laughter would rise like music she could never join. Her hands would press gently against the glass. Not to escape, but to understand. Why was she always on the other side of everything? That question had no answer. Only silence answered her. Always silence. The village was small, but its beliefs were enormous. It followed ancient rules, laws not written in books, but in fear passed through generations. Purity was everything. Deviation was corruption. And anything that disrupted natural order was considered a threat not just to families, but to entire bloodlines. Nearby kingdoms reinforced these beliefs. Travelers spoke of distant lands where abnormal births were recorded and removed. Not always with cruelty. Sometimes with ritual. Sometimes with exile. But always with certainty. Because certainty made fear easier to live with. Inside this world, her existence was not just unfortunate. It was politically dangerous. Her family lived under constant pressure. Whispers followed them in markets. Silences formed when they walked past others. Even friendly conversations ended too quickly when her presence became known. Her parents began to change. Not all at once. Slowly. Like something breaking under invisible weight. Her father stopped speaking her name entirely. Her mother began locking doors more often. And the house that once sheltered life began preparing for separation. One evening, the father returned home later than usual. His face was pale. Not angry. Not sad. Empty. He stood at the doorway for a long time before entering. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "We cannot hide this anymore." Her mother froze. The child, sitting in the corner, did not understand the weight behind those words. But she felt it. Children always feel before they understand. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden walls like something waiting. Inside, silence thickened. The father continued. "The village is asking questions. The elders are watching us. If they discover her fully, we will all be punished." Her mother shook her head slightly, as if denial could rewrite reality. "She is just a child." But her voice lacked strength. Because even love weakens when fear grows long enough. The father looked at the floor. Not at the child. Not at his wife. At nothing. And then he said the sentence that broke something invisible in the room. "We cannot keep her." The child did not understand those words. But she understood the change in atmosphere. Something was ending. Something she could not name. Her mother covered her mouth to stop a sound from escaping. The father turned away as if facing her would make it worse. And in that moment, a decision was made without being spoken fully. Not out of cruelty, but out of surrender. They would sell her. The night arrived without warning. No ceremony. No explanation. Just movement. The child was awakened gently, almost carefully, as if tenderness could soften betrayal. She was wrapped in a cloth. Not like a daughter being protected, but like something being concealed. She did not cry. Not because she was strong. Because she did not yet understand she should. Her mother held her for a moment longer than necessary. That moment carried everything words could not. Love. Guilt. Fear. Loss. But none of it was enough to stop what had already begun. Outside, two figures waited. Traders. Not cruel in expression. Not kind either. Neutral. That neutrality was worse than hatred. Because it meant her fate was already decided. Her father did not look at her directly. His voice broke slightly as he spoke to the traders. "Take her, and end this." The words "end this" did not refer to the child, but to their fear. And fear always demands sacrifice. The child was lifted into the wagon. And as the wheels began to move, she finally looked back. Not understanding goodbye. Only feeling distance forming where warmth once existed. The house grew smaller. The village disappeared. And the world she knew was gone. The wagon moved through empty roads. Night swallowed everything around her. The traders spoke occasionally, but not about her. As if she was already irrelevant to them. Outside, something unusual happened. Animals along the path refused to approach. Dogs barked once, then stopped abruptly. Birds lifted from trees too early, as if disturbed by something unseen. But no one commented. Because noticing would require curiosity. And curiosity was dangerous in their line of work. The child sat silently, watching the world move without her permission. She did not cry. Not because she understood strength, but because she had already learned invisibility. The wind brushed against her pale hair. For a moment, it felt like the world itself was unsure whether she belonged in it. Ahead, the road stretched endlessly. And far beyond that road, a frozen kingdom waited. Unaware that something it had never expected was already moving toward it. The wagon disappeared into the dark horizon. And behind it, the village that sold her returned to silence. But it was not peace. It was avoidance. Because deep down, something in them knew. They had not erased a curse. They had only sent it somewhere else. And somewhere far away, the White Alpha King was preparing for a ritual that would change everything. But destiny does not announce itself. It only waits. And it was already watching her move through the dark. The world continued moving as if nothing had changed. But for the child, everything had ended. The wagon rolled through endless darkness, its wooden wheels grinding against broken roads that had forgotten kindness long ago. The night sky above was heavy, clouded, lifeless. Not even stars dared to shine brightly over this part of the world. Inside the wagon, the girl sat quietly. Not crying. Not speaking. Just watching. Her small hands rested in her lap, still wrapped in the same cloth her mother had once held her with. That cloth no longer felt warm. It felt distant, like a memory belonging to someone else. The traders did not look at her. Not once. To them, she was not a child. Not even a burden. She was simply cargo. And cargo does not feel. Or so they believed. But something about her silence made the air feel different. Not louder. Not heavier. Just unfamiliar. Like the world was holding its breath without knowing why. Hours passed. The road stretched endlessly forward. Then something strange happened. The horses slowed. Not because of command. But because of hesitation. One of the traders frowned. "Keep moving," he muttered. But the animals refused to respond normally. Their ears turned backward. Their steps became uneven. As if something ahead was wrong. The wagon passed through a narrow forest path. And that's when it happened. The wind stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. As if someone had cut the world's breath in half. The leaves above them froze mid-motion. Even the sound of wheels seemed distant, muted, unreal. The girl lifted her head slightly. She did not understand what was happening. But she felt it. Something was reacting. Not to the traders. Not to the wagon. But to her. A bird suddenly flew overhead, then changed direction violently, as if escaping something it could not see. One of the traders finally noticed. Strange weather. But he dismissed it quickly. Because people like him never liked questions that had no easy answers. And so the wagon continued. Deeper into uncertainty. Behind them, the village faded completely into memory. No one spoke her name anymore. Because she no longer had one there. And in the absence of a name, a person becomes easier to erase. The traders spoke among themselves in low voices. They talked about destinations. About payment. About the next group of outcasts they would collect. But never about her. It was as if acknowledging her would give her importance. And importance was something they refused to assign. The girl listened. Not because she understood. But because she had no other sound to hold on to. Inside her chest, something unfamiliar pressed gently. Not pain. Not fear. Something quieter. Loneliness that had no shape. She turned her gaze to the passing darkness outside. The trees looked taller here. The air colder. And somewhere far ahead, the land itself felt different. Like it was waiting. Not for travelers. But for something else entirely. Days were not clearly marked in the wagon. Time lost meaning when nothing changed. The girl could not tell how long she had been traveling. Only that hunger came and went. Sleep came and went. Silence never left. At some point, one of the traders finally spoke to her. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Just practically. "You'll be sold soon." The words did not land like emotion. They landed like information. She tilted her head slightly. She did not understand the full meaning. But she understood enough to feel the shift. Sold. Like objects. Like tools. Like things that belonged to someone else. She looked down at her hands. Small. Still. Existing. But apparently, without value. The trader noticed her gaze but did not respond. Because people like him had learned something simple. If you do not treat something as human long enough, you stop seeing it as human at all. The air changed first. Subtly. Almost unnoticeably. The warmth of distant lands began to fade. The wind became sharper. The sky began to lose color. And slowly, everything started to feel frozen. Even sound behaved differently. The wagon crossed into lands where silence was not absence, but presence. The traders grew quieter. Not out of respect. Out of discomfort. They knew what lay ahead. The White Alpha Kingdom. A place spoken of in warnings rather than stories. A land ruled by a king whose name was never said lightly. The White Alpha King. Not because he was kind. Not because he was cruel. But because he was absolute. And absolute power always creates fear in those who understand it too well. The girl felt the change too. But she did not understand it. Only that the world no longer felt like the same place she had left. Something vast was approaching. Something larger than anything she had known. And she was being carried directly toward it. In distant halls of power, far from the wagon's path, whispers were already spreading. The lunar selection ritual was near. A sacred event held once in many years. Not controlled by politics. Not controlled by families. But believed to be guided by fate itself. Every eligible soul from surrounding lands would be brought forward. And among them, one would be chosen. The destined Luna of the White Alpha King. No one knew how the selection truly worked. Some believed it was bloodline resonance. Others believed it was ancient magic. Others feared it was something far older than both. But everyone agreed on one truth. Whoever was chosen would change everything. The girl, of course, knew nothing of this. She only knew the wagon continued moving toward colder lands. Toward unfamiliar silence. Toward a destiny that had already started forming long before she could resist it. The wagon stopped near the edge of a frozen forest. The traders decided to rest. The fire they made burned weakly, struggling against the cold air. The girl sat near the wagon's edge. Not restrained. Not guarded. Because no one believed she would run. Where would she even go? One of the traders glanced at her briefly, then looked away again. As if she was already irrelevant. But something about that moment shifted the atmosphere. The forest around them felt unusually still. No insects. No wind. No distant animal calls. Only silence. One of the horses stamped its foot nervously. Another refused to lie down. But again, no one questioned it deeply. Because questioning meant fear. And fear slows business. The girl looked into the forest. And for the first time, she felt something looking back. Not a voice. Not a shape. Just awareness. Like the world itself had noticed her arrival. But not yet revealed why. Morning came without warmth. The wagon crossed into structured roads. Stone pathways replaced dirt. Tall structures began appearing in the distance. Walls. Watchtowers. Symbols carved into stone that meant nothing to her. But meant everything to those who understood them. They had arrived at the outer region of the White Alpha Kingdom. The traders finally spoke with more energy. This is it. Good price for this batch. The girl was lifted down from the wagon. Her feet touched cold stone for the first time. She looked around slowly. Everything felt too large. Too structured. Too unfamiliar. She did not belong here. But more importantly, no one had asked if she should. She was guided forward with others. Other girls. Other selected ones. But none of them looked like her. None carried her silence. None carried her absence of belonging. And yet, something in the air shifted again as she walked. Not toward fear. Not toward danger. But toward recognition. As if the world had finally reached the place where her story was meant to begin. That night, as she stood within foreign walls for the first time. Far beyond the kingdom's center. A throne room remained silent. A king sat unmoving. Watching. Waiting. Not for arrival. But for confirmation. Because somewhere in the balance of fate, something had already begun aligning. And the girl who had been sold in shame was now standing at the edge of something far larger than exile. Something that would not erase her, but redefine her existence entirely. And the world was not ready for what it had just brought inside its gates. The gates of the White Alpha Kingdom opened without ceremony, yet the moment the girl stepped through them, it felt as if the world itself had acknowledged a shift that no one had announced aloud. The stone beneath her feet was colder than anything she had ever known, not just in temperature but in presence, as though it carried centuries of silence compressed into physical form. Around her, towering walls rose like immovable judgment, and beyond them stretched a city that did not resemble anything from her past life. Everything here was structured, controlled, and deliberate, as if even air followed rules. She walked forward without understanding where she was being taken, only that she was no longer part of the world she once knew. The traders who had brought her here now seemed smaller, less important, their task nearly complete. They spoke with officials in low tones, exchanging words that carried no meaning for her, only the repeated sensation that her existence was being processed, not acknowledged. She was moved forward along with other girls who had been gathered from distant regions, each of them dressed differently, each of them carrying expressions of confusion, pride, fear, or ambition, but none of them carrying emptiness the way she did. She did not know what she was meant to feel because for most of her life she had been taught not to feel anything at all. As they were led deeper into the kingdom, the architecture began to change subtly, becoming more refined, more imposing, more aware of its own authority. Statues lined the pathways, each one depicting figures that seemed larger than life, warriors, rulers, and symbols of something ancient that the girl could not interpret. The air itself felt different here, not just cold but charged, like an unseen force was circulating through every structure and every open space. Occasionally, she would notice guards watching the group pass, their expressions unreadable, but their attention never lingering on others the way it did on her. It was not curiosity or recognition. It was something closer to uncertainty, as if her presence caused a small disruption in their trained perception of reality. She did not understand why. She only felt it. The group was eventually brought into a vast hall where silence waited like a living thing. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into shadows that were not entirely natural. Light entered through narrow openings, falling in controlled patterns across the floor, as though even illumination was designed with intention. This was not a place built for gathering. It was a place built for judgment. The girls were instructed to stand in formation, though no explanation was given as to what would follow. Some of them whispered quietly, trying to understand their purpose, while others stood confidently, as if already believing they were meant to be chosen. The albino girl stood slightly apart, not by choice, but because the space around her naturally remained empty. No one pushed her away. No one called her forward. It simply happened that way, as if the world itself had decided her distance. High above them, unseen by most, a presence observed everything. The White Alpha King sat in a chamber connected to the hall through architecture that allowed vision without exposure. He did not speak. He did not move. He only watched. His gaze passed over each candidate, not in judgment of appearance alone, but in something deeper, something that could not be easily defined by others. To him, every soul carried weight, and that weight either aligned with something greater or fell away as noise. The kingdom believed this ritual was tradition. But he understood it differently. It was recognition. Not selection by desire, but by resonance. And resonance could not be forced. As his attention moved across the group, the usual patterns appeared. Some carried loud ambition that echoed too sharply. Some carried fear that distorted their presence. Some carried confidence that masked instability. But then his perception shifted when it reached the edge of the formation. There, where the space remained unusually untouched, stood the girl. At first glance, she appeared insignificant compared to others. No noble energy. No trained elegance. No visible strength. Yet something about her silence was different. It was not absence. It was depth. A silence so complete that it did not feel empty, but infinite. As if everything the world had thrown at her had been absorbed instead of expressed. That kind of silence was rare. And dangerous in ways most people could not understand. Down below, the girl remained unaware of the observation happening above her. She only felt pressure in the air, subtle but persistent, as though unseen currents were shifting around her without explanation. For the first time since arriving in this kingdom, she felt something resembling awareness directed at her, though she could not identify its source. It did not feel like the gaze of ordinary people. It felt heavier, more precise, as if something beyond physical sight was trying to interpret her existence. This sensation created discomfort she could not name. Not fear. Not safety. Something in between. The hall remained in controlled silence as preparations for the ritual began. Officials moved through the space, ensuring order. The candidates were instructed to remain still. The air grew more focused, as though the kingdom itself was preparing for a moment that had been anticipated for years. Outside the hall, nobles gathered in adjacent chambers, their conversations filled with expectation, prediction, and political calculation. Many believed the outcome was already determined by obvious factors such as lineage, beauty, or influence. None of them considered anything beyond what they could measure. That was the difference between them and the force guiding the ritual itself. The White Alpha King finally rose from his position. His movement was slow, deliberate, and absolute in presence. The atmosphere responded instantly, becoming sharper, more attentive. Even without words, his authority shaped the space around him. He descended toward the hall where the candidates stood, and as he approached, silence deepened further, not out of fear alone, but out of recognition that something final was near. Every step he took was measured not by distance, but by consequence. As he entered the hall, every candidate instinctively reacted in subtle ways. Some straightened. Some lowered their gaze. Some held their breath. But the albino girl remained unchanged in posture. Not out of defiance, but because she did not understand what she was standing before. She had no framework to interpret power of this scale. She only felt the air shift again, more strongly now, as if the presence she had vaguely sensed earlier had finally become physically closer. The king moved slowly along the line of candidates, his gaze passing over them without hesitation. With each passing moment, the tension in the room increased. Nobles watching from above began to lean forward, anticipating confirmation of their expectations. Some whispered names they believed would be chosen. Others mentally calculated political outcomes. But none of these predictions mattered within the space he occupied. Because what he was evaluating could not be seen by them. When his steps finally slowed near the end of the formation, something changed in the rhythm of observation. His gaze paused. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. But definitively. The pause itself carried weight. It was not hesitation. It was recognition. The room, without fully understanding why, began to feel that something irreversible was forming. The girl stood in that exact space. Still unaware. Still unchanged. But no longer unseen. In that moment, something subtle but profound occurred. The connection between observer and observed stabilized, as if 2 points in reality had aligned after drifting separately for a long time. The king's expression did not change, yet internally, something had been confirmed. Not preference. Not emotion. Recognition of something that others had missed entirely. The hall, however, did not understand this shift. To them, silence meant uncertainty. And uncertainty quickly transformed into assumption. Confusion spread among observers as they tried to interpret what they were witnessing. A candidate without lineage. Without visible strength. Without influence. Standing at the center of something sacred. It did not fit their understanding of order. The girl, sensing attention intensify, finally lifted her gaze slightly. For the first time since arriving, she felt truly seen. Not as an object. Not as an outcast. But as something that disrupted expectation. The feeling was unfamiliar. It created discomfort, but also a faint curiosity she did not yet understand. Above all this, the king remained still. And in his stillness, the decision formed without announcement. Not as spoken declaration yet, but as inevitable outcome already decided within unseen layers of the ritual. And in that suspended moment, before the world could fully react, reality itself seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for permission to continue forward. Because what was about to happen next would not simply be a choice. It would be a rupture in everything the kingdom believed it understood. The hall remained suspended in a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as if reality itself had paused to witness something it did not yet know how to interpret. Every breath within the chamber seemed restrained, not by fear alone but by expectation so intense it pressed against the walls. The candidates stood frozen in formation, unaware that the structure of their lives was about to collapse within seconds. Above them, the nobles leaned forward in controlled anticipation, believing they were moments away from witnessing a predictable outcome shaped by tradition, lineage, and power. Everything about this ritual had always followed patterns they understood. Everything had always been explainable. That belief was the foundation of their confidence. But the White Alpha King stood within the center of that belief, and he did not operate within explanations. His presence alone reshaped the atmosphere. It was not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. When he moved, even slightly, the space acknowledged him before people did. His gaze remained steady as it passed over the candidates once more, not searching, not hesitating, but confirming something already understood at a level beyond spoken logic. The girl stood among them, still unaware of what was forming around her existence. She had lived her entire life being unnoticed or rejected, and even here, surrounded by a kingdom of power, she still carried the instinct of invisibility. Yet something had changed in the way the space interacted with her. It no longer ignored her. It surrounded her with quiet focus, as though the world had finally decided she was no longer background. The king took a final step forward. That step was not dramatic, yet it carried the weight of completion. It was the kind of movement that did not signal uncertainty but resolution. Every observer felt it before they understood it. The nobles stiffened slightly, their confidence beginning to fracture as instinct replaced assumption. The candidates sensed the shift without knowing its cause. Even the air seemed to tighten, as if the environment itself recognized a threshold being crossed. And then it happened. The king stopped directly before her. Not in passing. Not in evaluation. But in finality. The hall did not react immediately because comprehension failed to arrive at the same speed as reality. For a brief moment, there was only stillness. A stillness so complete that even thought seemed delayed. The girl stood beneath his presence without understanding why attention had gathered so intensely around her. She did not know what selection meant in this context. She only knew that the air felt heavier than before, as if something invisible had settled over her existence. Above, confusion began to rise like a slow wave. Nobles shifted in their positions, unable to reconcile what they were witnessing. The expectation that had been building for days, months, perhaps years, fractured at its foundation. They had prepared for a selection based on strength, lineage, or visible resonance. What they saw instead defied those categories entirely. The king's attention remained fixed on the one candidate who represented none of their expectations. Within that moment of suspended reality, something deeper occurred beneath perception. The ritual, ancient in its origin, responded not to tradition but to alignment. The selection process was not truly political. It was not symbolic. It was reactive to forces that existed beneath conscious understanding. And in this moment, that force had aligned itself toward her. The girl felt it before she understood it. A subtle pressure formed in her chest, not painful, but unfamiliar, as if something within her had been acknowledged after a lifetime of silence. Her instincts told her to remain still. Her past taught her to remain invisible. But invisibility no longer functioned in this space. Something had already recognized her presence too completely to ignore. The king lifted his hand slowly. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and final. Every observer interpreted that motion differently in the seconds before understanding caught up. Some believed it was a mistake about to be corrected. Others believed it was symbolic hesitation before choosing someone else. But those interpretations dissolved instantly when his hand came to rest in absolute certainty. The selection had been made. Not announced yet. But completed. The moment the implication became undeniable, the hall fractured into reaction. Not physically, but emotionally and politically. Nobles reacted first with disbelief, their structured understanding of hierarchy collapsing under the weight of contradiction. The idea that the chosen Luna could be someone without recognized status disrupted not only expectation but identity. If selection was not bound by their system of value, then the system itself lost meaning. Confusion rapidly transformed into outrage among certain factions. Some stood in disbelief, unable to reconcile logic with reality. Others began calculating consequences, already recognizing that this decision would alter alliances, destabilize agreements, and fracture long-standing power structures. Fear entered the room not because of the girl, but because of what her selection represented. It suggested that the foundations of their control were not absolute. The girl, meanwhile, remained still. Her mind could not process the scale of what was happening. She only understood fragments. She had been noticed. Not ignored. Not discarded. But chosen. The concept itself was foreign to her internal understanding of existence. Her entire life had been structured around absence of value, and now value was being assigned to her in a way she could not interpret. The king finally moved his gaze slightly, not away from her, but through her, as if acknowledging something beyond surface identity. His expression remained unchanged, but the decision within him had already settled beyond reversal. The selection was not emotional. It was not political. It was recognition of alignment that others could not perceive. As realization spread, the nobles' reactions intensified. Some attempted to question internally whether this could be reversed, but ritual law prevented interference once selection was confirmed. Others began to understand something more dangerous. If the king had chosen beyond their comprehension, then his awareness extended beyond theirs. That implication alone destabilized confidence that had been built over generations. The hall itself seemed to react to the shift. Subtle changes occurred in the atmosphere. Light patterns within the structure flickered slightly, not due to physical disturbance, but due to resonance changes within the ritual space. Something deeper than architecture was responding. The girl felt a strange pull within her, not outward but inward, as if something dormant had been acknowledged for the first time. It was not awakening fully, but it was no longer silent. Her existence, once defined by absence, now carried weight she could not understand. The king turned slightly, signaling completion of selection protocol. That motion alone confirmed what everyone already feared or resisted acknowledging. The decision was final. Irrevocable. Absolute. Chaos did not erupt immediately in sound. It began in restraint breaking. Nobles who had maintained composure began speaking simultaneously, their voices overlapping into disorder. Guards shifted positions not to restrain action, but to maintain structure. Even they were not immune to uncertainty. The system that had governed expectations was no longer stable. The girl was approached by attendants, not as prisoner, but as chosen. That distinction altered everything. She was not being removed for punishment. She was being elevated into a role she did not understand. As she was guided forward, she turned slightly, glancing once more at the space she had stood in moments earlier. It no longer felt like rejection. It no longer felt like invisibility. It felt like transition. Above all chaos, the king remained still. His stillness was not indifference. It was confirmation that nothing about this moment required reconsideration. The world around him reacted, but he did not. That difference defined the divide between perception and understanding. As she was led away from the formation, a subtle change occurred in the atmosphere that no one immediately identified. It was not celebration. It was not acceptance. It was anticipation. Because somewhere beneath the visible world, forces that had been dormant for an unknown time had begun to respond. The selection was not the end of a process. It was the beginning of something that had been waiting to be triggered. And as the doors of the hall opened to escort her into the unknown, the last trace of her old existence dissolved behind her without resistance. What she was walking toward was not just a throne, not just a kingdom, but something that the world had forgotten it was ever afraid of. And the White Alpha King had just revealed that fear to the world again without speaking a single word. The kingdom did not understand silence anymore. Not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that follows something irreversible. After the selection, the girl was no longer in the hall where her fate had been decided. She was no longer standing among others who had once ignored her existence. She was moving through corridors that had never been meant for someone like her. Every step she took felt like a contradiction to everything she had been taught about herself. The world that once refused to acknowledge her now responded to her presence with structured obedience. Guards did not push her. Servants did not question her. The air itself seemed adjusted around her passage, as if reality had accepted a new rule without announcing it. But inside her, there was no understanding of victory or destiny. There was only confusion layered over years of absence. Her life had never prepared her for being chosen. It had only prepared her for being discarded. So even now, in the heart of a kingdom built on power she could not comprehend, she still expected the moment to reverse. She still expected someone to stop and say there had been a mistake. Yet no one did. Because there had been no mistake. Far above the corridors she walked through, the White Alpha King remained within his chamber. He did not follow her physically, but his presence was no longer distant. It had already extended into the structure of the kingdom itself. What others called authority was something deeper in him, something that did not require movement to influence existence. He stood alone, not because he was isolated, but because what he carried could not coexist casually with ordinary perception. The ritual had ended in appearance, but in truth, it had only shifted form. What had been selection was now transition. What had been observation was now consequence. Outside the palace, the kingdom had already begun to fracture emotionally. Nobles who had witnessed the selection could not return to their previous certainty. The idea that fate could bypass bloodline, status, and expectation had introduced instability into systems built over generations. Some reacted with denial, insisting the ritual must have been misinterpreted. Others began forming quiet alliances, not to accept the decision, but to prepare against it. Fear rarely speaks loudly at first. It organizes itself before it acts. But beneath all political reaction, something deeper was occurring. The world itself was responding. Not visibly, not immediately, but in ways that could not be ignored over time. Across distant regions, subtle disruptions began appearing. Ancient seals that had remained dormant for centuries showed faint irregularities. Weather patterns shifted in isolated territories without explanation. Animals in remote forests reacted to unseen pressures, avoiding certain directions as if instinctively aware of imbalance. None of these events were connected on the surface. But something beneath reality had begun to stir. And at the center of that disturbance stood a girl who had once been sold as if she meant nothing. Within the inner chambers of the White Alpha Kingdom, she was finally given a space that resembled shelter, though it did not feel like safety to her. She did not yet understand the difference between protection and possession. The room she was placed in was vast, designed with intention that far exceeded comfort. Everything around her carried purpose. Nothing existed without meaning. Even silence here felt structured. She stood in the center of it for a long time without moving. Not because she was told to stay, but because she did not know where else to go. Her mind kept returning to earlier memories, fragments of a life that now felt distant beyond recognition. The house that once rejected her. The silence that once defined her existence. The feeling of being unseen, not occasionally, but constantly. Those memories did not hurt in a sharp way. They felt like echoes of something that belonged to someone else. And yet, her body still remembered what her mind could not reconcile. That she was never supposed to be here. Not in this place. Not in any place of importance. And certainly not chosen. The contradiction of her existence began to press inward slowly. Not breaking her, but reshaping the foundation of how she understood herself. She had been told, directly or indirectly, throughout her life that she was an error. Now reality itself was refusing that definition, and that conflict created a silence inside her that was heavier than fear. The White Alpha King finally appeared not through grand entrance, but through presence becoming noticeable within the room itself. He did not approach her immediately. He observed her the same way he had in the hall, but now without distance. There was no ceremony between them anymore. The selection had already happened. What remained was understanding what that selection meant. He studied her not as others did. Not as a symbol. Not as a mistake corrected. But as a truth that existed independently of interpretation. She did not meet his gaze fully at first. Her instinct was still shaped by years of avoidance. But slowly, she felt something different in his presence. It did not carry rejection. It did not carry judgment. It carried recognition in a form she could not yet translate. For the first time in her life, silence around her did not feel like erasure. It felt like attention without harm. That realization did not bring immediate comfort. It brought uncertainty, because everything she had learned about attention had been connected to danger. And now attention existed without visible threat. That contradiction became the beginning of internal change. Outside, the kingdom's reaction continued to escalate in unseen layers. Some factions began questioning the legitimacy of the ritual itself. Others began researching historical records that had long been ignored, searching for patterns that might explain why someone like her could be chosen. In doing so, they began uncovering fragments of older knowledge. References to selection events that had occurred in distant eras, when the world operated under different rules. Most of those records had been dismissed as myth or symbolic writing. Now they no longer felt irrelevant. Because patterns were beginning to align again. And alignment always meant repetition of something forgotten. The White Alpha King, however, showed no interest in defending his decision publicly. He did not justify it. He did not explain it. His silence was not avoidance. It was confirmation that explanation was unnecessary for something already understood at a level beyond political structure. Instead, attention gradually shifted toward the girl's condition. Not physical, but existential. Because subtle changes had already begun within her. At first, they were imperceptible. Small shifts in perception. Moments where the environment reacted slightly to her emotional state. Not consciously. Not controlled. But responsive. When she felt overwhelmed, the air around her seemed to tighten. When she felt still, the space around her seemed to stabilize. These reactions were not understood by her, nor fully observed by others yet. But they were real. And they were growing. The king observed this without surprise. As if it confirmed something he had already known. Time within the kingdom began to feel layered. Days passed normally on the surface, but beneath them, tension accumulated. The nobles could not openly oppose the decision due to ritual law, but resistance does not require direct action to exist. It only requires persistence. And persistence began forming in quiet places. Meanwhile, the girl remained within the inner domain, slowly adjusting to a reality that refused to match her internal identity. She was given space, but not direction. She was given presence, but not explanation. And in that absence of instruction, she began to experience something unfamiliar. Choice. Not imposed. Not denied. But existing. It frightened her more than rejection ever had. Because rejection was something she understood. Choice was something she had never been prepared for. The king eventually spoke to the space between them in silence that carried intention rather than words. What passed between them was not conversation in the traditional sense, but recognition of imbalance being acknowledged by both sides differently. She did not understand everything he represented, but she understood enough to recognize that her existence was being viewed through a framework far older than her past life. And within that framework, she was not nothing. She was not mistake. She was something waiting. As this realization slowly settled across the narrative of her existence, the world outside continued to shift in parallel. Boundaries between kingdoms became more cautious. Surveillance increased. Information networks activated. Something about the selection had destabilized equilibrium across regions that had once considered themselves separate. Because what had been chosen in the White Alpha Kingdom was not just a person. It was a signal. And signals always attract response. The final moment of Act 5 did not arrive with explosion or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it arrived through quiet awareness spreading across multiple layers of reality at once. The girl stood alone in her chamber one night, not asleep, not fully awake, simply existing within the in-between state of adjustment. And in that silence, she felt it again. Not fear. Not rejection. But awareness returning from the world itself. As if something vast had finally confirmed that she was no longer invisible. And somewhere beyond the visible structures of power, something ancient responded to that confirmation. Not with arrival, but with recognition. Because her selection had not completed a story. It had reopened one. One that the world had once buried so deeply it forgot it was still alive. And as the final frame of her present existence settled into uncertain calm, one truth remained unspoken but undeniable across everything. She was no longer the girl who was sold. She was the girl the world could no longer erase. And what came next was something even the White Alpha King was not speaking about yet. Because some awakenings do not begin with words. They begin with imbalance. And imbalance always demands correction. The kingdom had learned something it did not want to accept. Silence was no longer empty. It was waiting. In the days after the selection, everything that once felt stable began to feel slightly misaligned, as if reality itself had been shifted by a degree too small to immediately notice but too large to ignore over time. The White Alpha Kingdom remained visually unchanged. The walls still stood. The order still functioned. The rituals still continued in name. But beneath that surface, something fundamental had been disrupted. And at the center of that disruption was a girl who had once been sold without value. She no longer lived in the outer shadows of the palace. She was no longer treated as invisible. Yet she also did not belong to anything that could define her. She existed in a space the kingdom had not prepared language for. Not prisoner. Not royalty. Not guest. Something in between categories that were never designed to overlap. The White Alpha King did not correct this ambiguity. Because ambiguity, to him, was not error. It was truth still forming. And truth always begins undefined. The girl, however, did not understand any of this consciously. Her world had always been simple in structure, even when painful in experience. There were those who belonged and those who did not. There were those who were seen and those who were ignored. There were those who were chosen and those who were discarded. She had lived entirely within the discarded category long enough that even now, surrounded by power that bent toward her existence, her internal identity had not fully caught up with external reality. She still expected reversal. Still expected correction. Still expected the world to realize it had made a mistake. But nothing reversed. Nothing corrected. And slowly, that absence of reversal began to reshape her understanding of herself in ways she could not yet articulate. Within the palace, time did not feel normal anymore. It did not break or distort in visible ways, but it lost consistency in emotional perception. Some days felt heavier than others without reason. Some nights felt longer despite identical passage of hours. Servants reported feeling watched in empty corridors, though nothing was there. Guards reported unease in areas where no threat existed. These were not coincidences. They were reactions. Subtle responses from a system adjusting to a new variable it did not yet comprehend. The girl herself began to notice changes within her own perception. At first, they were minor distortions. Reflections lingering slightly too long. Shadows shifting when she was not moving. The air becoming still in her immediate presence when her emotions stabilized. She did not yet interpret these as power. She interpreted them as instability in her surroundings, something external and unrelated to her existence. But the White Alpha King observed differently. He did not explain. He did not interfere. He only confirmed. Because what was unfolding was not transformation imposed from outside. It was recognition of something already present within her that had simply never been allowed to express itself. Elsewhere, far beyond the palace, the consequences of the selection began expanding in ways no political system could fully control. Kingdoms that once considered themselves distant from White Alpha influence now found themselves indirectly affected by its shift in internal alignment. Trade routes felt less predictable. Alliances felt less stable. Information became more fragmented. It was not war. It was uncertainty spreading through structured systems like cracks forming beneath polished surfaces. And beneath all of it, older forces began responding. Not openly. Not visibly. But in forgotten places where history had been buried rather than preserved. Ancient markings, long dismissed as symbolic decoration, began to regain structural coherence when re-examined. Ruins that had been sealed for centuries showed faint signs of resonance when exposed to environmental changes linked to the kingdom's shift. Even the natural world in distant regions reacted in subtle but consistent ways, as if recalibrating around something newly activated. None of this pointed directly to the girl in obvious terms. But everything pointed toward alignment. And alignment always had origin points. Inside the palace, the girl was eventually brought to a higher chamber where the White Alpha King would occasionally observe her presence without intrusion. The space was not designed for conversation or ritual. It was designed for awareness. A place where distance between observer and observed was minimized without physical closeness. She stood there often without instruction, simply existing in a place she did not yet understand. At first, she would remain rigid, uncertain of what was expected of her. Over time, That rigidity softened into stillness. Not comfort, but adaptation. Stillness had been her survival language. But now, stillness was becoming something else entirely. The king's presence in these moments was not constant in physical form, but consistent in awareness. When he was present, the atmosphere carried a subtle shift that did not pressure her, but clarified reality around her. It was in those moments that she began to feel something unfamiliar again. Not fear. Not rejection. Not even curiosity. Recognition. Not from her toward him alone, but from reality toward her existence. That recognition was the beginning of destabilization. Because a life built on absence cannot remain unchanged when absence is removed. As this internal shift slowly deepened, something else began forming in parallel. The White Alpha King did not act as though he was waiting for something to happen. He acted as though something had already begun happening long before her selection, and that what the world perceived as a beginning was actually a continuation of a process already in motion. He had not chosen her in the way others understood choice. He had responded to her. And response implies prior signal. The girl, however, remained unaware of this larger structure. Her awareness was still grounded in immediate experience. Food, space, silence, observation. These were the elements that defined her present reality. But even those elements began to subtly shift in meaning. Food felt less like necessity and more like grounding. Space felt less like isolation and more like transition. Silence felt less like absence and more like presence without form. These redefinitions were not taught. They emerged. Slowly. Inevitably. One night, the palace experienced something that could not be easily categorized within normal understanding. There was no attack, no intrusion, no visible disruption. Yet multiple sections of the structure simultaneously reported a feeling of pressure in the environment, as if reality itself had briefly tightened and released. Some described it as a pause in natural continuity. Others described it as a sensation of being briefly observed by something beyond spatial direction. The girl felt it too. But unlike others, she did not interpret it as external. For the first time, a faint question formed within her internal awareness that did not immediately dissolve. If everything around her reacted, what exactly was she? That question did not bring immediate answer. But it created internal space where none had existed before. And in that space, something dormant began to acknowledge its own possibility. The White Alpha King, upon observing these shifts, finally moved in a way he had not before. Not toward control. Not toward instruction. But toward proximity. Not physical necessity, but structural alignment. When he entered her presence now, the difference in perception between them was less about authority and more about scale. She still felt small in comparison, but no longer erased. The difference was critical. Because erasure implies non-existence, and scale implies existence within a larger system. That distinction marked the true turning point of her transformation. The kingdom, meanwhile, began dividing internally in ways that had not yet escalated into visible conflict but were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. Some factions began studying historical correlations between rare selection events and structural changes in global stability. Others began quietly preparing contingency frameworks in case the White Alpha Kingdom's internal shift resulted in external instability. None of them fully understood what had been triggered. But all of them understood one thing. Something had changed irreversibly, and it centered around the girl who was once discarded. As the final phase of this unfolding reached its natural peak, the girl experienced something that could no longer be dismissed as environmental anomaly. During a moment of deep silence, when she was alone within the chamber, the space around her did not simply respond subtly. It stabilized around her presence. Not in reaction, but in alignment. As if something within her had finally stopped resisting recognition. In that moment, she did not become powerful in the way stories define power. She became coherent within a system that had previously failed to categorize her. And coherence is far more dangerous than strength. Because strength can be opposed. But coherence cannot be ignored. The White Alpha King observed this moment without interruption. His role was not to guide what was already unfolding. It was to confirm that it was unfolding correctly according to forces older than both of them. And in that confirmation, a truth began settling into the structure of reality itself. She had not been chosen because she was special in the way kingdoms define special. She had been chosen because she was compatible with something the world had forgotten it was still connected to. Something buried beneath history. Something waiting beneath silence. Something that recognized her before she ever learned to recognize herself. And as the final moment of Act 6 settled into stillness, the kingdom did not experience resolution. When such individuals appeared, the world did not remain the same afterward. Inside the palace, the girl began experiencing something more direct than environmental response. She began noticing that her perception of space itself was becoming less rigid. Distances felt inconsistent at times, not physically, but perceptually. Hallways that should have felt long sometimes felt compressed. Rooms that should have felt confined sometimes felt expanded beyond their physical dimensions. She did not understand why. But the White Alpha King did. What she was experiencing was not distortion. It was alignment between internal perception and external structure beginning to collapse into unified response. In simpler terms, the boundary between her awareness and reality was thinning. Not breaking. Transitioning. One evening, a significant event occurred that marked the first undeniable fracture in the kingdom's assumed stability. During a routine structural ritual performed in one of the outer halls, a group of officials observed a brief interruption in the expected flow of environmental consistency. The ritual required stable atmospheric response to symbolic sequences. However, during this particular instance, the environment responded differently. Not violently, but incorrectly. Symbols that should have produced neutral stability instead triggered subtle resonance. The hall itself seemed to recognize presence that was not accounted for in its design. That presence was not physically visible, but conceptually undeniable, and it originated from the direction of the inner chambers where the girl resided. This was the first moment when the kingdom began to realize that what had changed was not political. It was structural, and structural change does not remain contained. The White Alpha King, upon observing this development, did not intervene to suppress it. Instead, he adjusted his understanding of the timeline. What others perceived as instability, he perceived as progression reaching a measurable threshold. The system was no longer simply reacting to her presence. It was integrating it. The girl, meanwhile, began reaching a new phase of internal awareness. She no longer questioned whether something was happening around her. She began questioning the relationship between her internal state and external response. This shift marked the beginning of self-recognition beyond trauma identity. For the first time, she began to consider that she was not only being observed by the world, but interacting with it. This realization did not bring immediate empowerment. It brought weight. Because interaction implies responsibility, even without instruction. And responsibility without understanding is instability. The final stage of this act did not occur through external conflict, but through convergence. During a moment of deep silence within the palace, she experienced a state where internal emotion, environmental response, and external observation aligned simultaneously. In that moment, the boundary between her existence and the system around her became almost indistinguishable. The White Alpha King witnessed this without reaction. Because reaction was no longer required. What he was observing was not transformation completing. It was transition stabilizing. And stabilization always precedes revelation. Across the kingdom and beyond it, subtle systems began responding in synchronized irregularity. Not chaos, but adjustment. As if multiple layers of reality were preparing for a configuration that had not existed in recorded history. And at the center of all of it was a girl who had once been sold because the world believed she did not matter. Now, the world was beginning to adjust itself around the possibility that it had been wrong. Not slightly, but fundamentally. And that realization had only just begun to spread.